I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer at Gold Derby, and I am joined today by Joel Edgerton, who stars as Arnold Ridgeway on Barry Jenkins' 10-episode limited series, The Underground Railroad. So Joel, you get this part. You read Colson Whitehead's novel from which the show is adapted, as well as the show's scripts, both of which offer such a tremendous wealth of information about your character. What was the next step in your preparation process?
Oh, good question. I mean, it's interesting because I feel like the real grounding research that needs to be done for any role should exist in the script or in the source material. It's interesting, the research that I did was not so much research as much as real deep thinking about the family relationships and the personal relationships within the story. For the reason that I think often that when you're dealing with a subject that people might perceive as a period project, I think it's very important to try and find the connectivity with a modern society. And I think Barry's show has so many kind of lines that can be connected to modern society. And I think as a character or as an actor, approaching a character, very, very important to really look at not so much researching custom and etiquette of a period, and I think that is important, but secondary to what's important with the relationships. And in the case of Ridgeway, I did a lot of thinking about father-son relationships in regards to my relationship with my father in the show and with regards to my relationship with Chase W. Dillon. And that to me was key, and that was key conversation that I was having with Barry about the show.
And before we get into some of those dynamics and relationships, I have to assume that your first reaction to reading this character was in part disgust and repulsion and maybe even extreme judgment. But at one point, did you, as the actor who was going to play this part, find a way to say, okay, I'm going to put my judgment aside and try to get to know this guy, to try to understand where he is coming from and what his engine really is?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I was quite terrified about taking on the role, but I will say that my inclination has always been that you have to find the light in the darkness and attempt to find the darkness in the light. And by that I mean, if somebody wants me to play a heroic character, it's like what I'm interested in is finding the flaws. And if somebody wants me to play a villainous character, what I'm searching for is not so much the virtues, but the flaws that help us to understand the makings of that character. In so much as the attempt is not to try to find a way to say empathize with someone like Arnold Ridgeway, but to at least get inside of him, that we understand what makes him who he is. And that to me is very important. And I think it makes for a more dimensional, more interesting venture as a performance, hopefully.
Absolutely. And I think characters who are morally ambiguous, so that might be too nice for Ridgeway, are some of the most interesting ones. And of course, there are also technical aspects that are part of this performance. You have this very deep and heavy Southern accent, and you're in hair and makeup and costume. Did these technical aspects also help get you into character ultimately?
Yeah, look, everything that was terrifying was alluring to me about this project. You know, I'm always terrified by accents, and that makes me really work hard at practicing or finding the right accent. You know, I really have to pay tribute to what I call like pit crew of an actor, which is costume, makeup, hair. You know, and I do believe an actor should engage in conversations about those things because they're so important to what you're about to do and what you do. But for the most part, we are really assisted in that regard. If those heads of department weren't up to like the top of their game, our performance would fall apart or wouldn't match up. And I feel like Barry picked that right team, and it really allowed me to go further, like to go beyond. I mean, there are times when a costume teaches you something, or that you can look in the mirror as a costume, look in the mirror as a character with a costume, with makeup, with everything that pit crew has done. And it unlocks something for you. And certainly that was the case for me. But you know, what's up to me is the accent. What's up to me is psychology in unison and conversation with Barry. And look, Barry gave this character maybe even more rope than you would expect of understanding, in order that we can get some kind of clue as to what made him come about. That became really interesting to me, to go down the road with him.
Absolutely. And in that regard, Ridgeway is one of the only characters whose backstory is actually explored on screen. So what was your initial reaction to reading that 4th episode titled The Great Spirit, knowing also that another actor, Fred Henchinger, was going to play young Arnold? Were you able to sit down with Fred and map out this backstory and have conversations with him?
Funnily enough, I accidentally met Fred at a party in New York. He came up to me in a friend of mine's house late one night, and he said, "Hey, you don't know me, but I'm about to sort of play you." And I was like, "What's this kid talking about?" And it just so happened that we'd run into each other a few weeks before we would have otherwise met on set.
Wow.
I was really happy that Barry had the backstory episode of The Great Spirit for my character, even though I wasn't in a single frame of it. Yeah. It was very important to me as another dimension. Now, if we were going to go and understand Ridgeway, then I think that was a really integral part to understand the pride, where the shame from his father came from. Mm-hmm. And what Fred did, what Barry did with Fred, really made my job more interesting and easier in a sense, because that information was there, delivered by other people. Now, I have to say that the fact that Barry gave the backstory to Ridgeway, and the fact that he allowed us to understand a little bit more about him than we would otherwise a villain, became one of the big deciding factors for me to get involved in the project. And the reason I think it's valid, and the reason why I can also understand why people might have a problem with understanding the villain so much, I believe it's really important for us to ask questions about how people like Arnold Ridgeway, how white extremists come to be who they are. And the show gives us a story, like one story of one man in Ridgeway. And I think it's important to ask, where do these people come from that are so filled with hate?
Yeah, absolutely. And you have said before that Ridgeway's father, who was a blacksmith who detests slavery and who employed only paid freedmen, tried to set Ridgeway on the right path, but that Ridgeway then became seduced by the trappings of wealth and success. What would you say ultimately led him astray? So why did he go down that path? And at what point was there no return for him?
Well, it is interesting. Often we're shown the story of a son growing up under a bigoted father and choosing to go a better road, a more humanistic road. In Barry's show, we get the opposite. As you point out, we get a father trying to teach his son that all men should be created equal, mm-hmm. all men and women, all humans should be treated in the same fashion. And yet he moves in the other direction. And I believe that he moves in that direction for a number of reasons. I think there's a question of that the river is flowing quite strongly in one direction and his father is moving against that tide. That's one thing. But I think personal injury from the father is something that I almost believe it quite sad to think that someone like Ridgeway, deep down, is behaving out of spite towards his father, and his father's disregard and feelings of shame towards him.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, even though his initial reason for turning to slave catching has, little to do with his feelings about slaves, he very much ends up embodying the foundation of slavery and of white supremacy, which was this belief that they were righteously governed by economic interests. And I know that in the novel, he very explicitly equates his job as a slave catcher with his father's job as a blacksmith, in the sense that he believes both are serving Eli Whitney, the real life inventor of the cotton gin. How did you take this bit of information from the novel, this justification that Ridgway uses, and incorporate it into your performance?
Well, there's interesting moments in the story. It's fascinating to me, as a friend of mine pointed out. He said, Ridgway acts out a lot of violence towards white men in the show. And white people in the show, and maybe even less than we're seeing depicted on screen towards black people, although I doubt in the margins of his life that is true. But he quite often is justifying his place right now in the universe as a man with white skin, and almost the way the chips have fallen with regards to race, and justifying things. Personally, getting back to the idea of research, what I found fascinating about, say, taking a walk through the wonderfully curated African American History Museum, was looking at the economics of slavery, the origins of slavery as an economic proposition. And Ridgway, we find, often talks in these terms, and yet there are other characters in the show that seem to have then taken those ideas, the embodiment or the sense of enlargement or power from that, the subjugation and the trip, I would call it the trip of power. And it's something that he doesn't necessarily prescribe to. It's like there's a clinical understanding of how things are and the reason why things are the way they are. That are all rooted in economics and a career that he takes pride in, that he assumes is a way, in some way, to match his father's pride. So Ridgway, in some senses, is not, diabolical in animal sense. He's diabolical in an intellectual justification sense, in my mind, if that makes any...
Absolutely, yes.
If I can make any sense at this time of the evening.
It absolutely does. And you've already touched on this a bit, but how much of Ridgway growing up, knowing that his father is deeply ashamed of him, knowing that he sees his son as a failure, informs Ridgway's obsession with tracking down Mabel, and then later tracking down Cora and returning her to the Randall plantation in Georgia?
Failure is not an option. This was a sort of a mantra for me with Ridgway. Failure is not an option. When you feel like you are a failure in your father's eyes, failure is definitely not an option. I think that the narcissism, and I use that word as a descriptive word for Ridgway, as a narcissist, the idea of failure would destroy his entire universe. And it's interesting that Ridgway has failed to bring back Cora's mother. And so the idea that Cora's gone missing becomes a latch, it becomes a projection for him, that if he can at least restore that balance, he can somehow kind of salve the wound of Cora's mother having outsmarted him. And certainly if Cora outsmarts him as well, the second generation outsmarts him, then I think that would destroy him. And as we see, spoiler alert,
Oh, yes.
maybe that's what is possibly going to happen to.
And in that regard, what goes through Ridgway's head once his father has passed away. And in the 9th episode, Cora is standing in front of him, pointing a gun at his face. Where is he emotionally in that very moment?
Well, it's interesting, you know, when the monster dies or when the monster disappears, the monster doesn't necessarily go away forever. I think personally, I think if our engine is one or both of our parents, even after death, that engine mysteriously or not so mysteriously still exists. I think that it's an interesting moment when a person loses a parent. There's whether you love or despise that person or anything in between, they continue to be the motivating factor that they are in your life. I think the problem for Ridgeway is he doesn't really get his answers, and the answers that he wants, the answer he really wants is that this humanistic ideal, this idea of quantum physics, this idea that, you know, the great spirit that exists, that we're all interconnected, that we're all, if we're lucky, we have a higher understanding that we're all connected. He wants to know that it's a myth. And yet I think deep down, he knows, and I think he knows subconsciously that it does exist. And the reason I say that is I think it exists in his relationship with Homer, as dysfunctional as it is. The idea that he's taken a young African-American boy under his wing, despite what he's getting him to do, engaging in the industry of slavery, is some correction of his past and some attempt to identify with the great spirit that his father preached to him.
What a fascinating explanation. And Barry Jenkins, of course, directed all 10 episodes of this show. So how was it for you having him guide you through the entirety of this experience and I guess help build and develop this incredibly complex character with him?
It felt like working with Barry over 10 episodes, it felt like we were making a 10-hour movie. I years and years and years ago, when I was more than half my life ago, I worked on a television series in Australia. And every week you'd be introducing yourself to a new director or picking up with somebody new. And often the producers felt like the keepers of the show. And even more than that, the actors felt more like gatekeepers of the show or their characters than anybody else. So to have a director that was standing in charge of everything, a captain of the entire voyage, meant so much. My only concern for Barry was his energy and his stamina, and I have to say, as open as he was about how exhausting a process that was, he never let the ball drop. He never let us down. He always looked after us. He was the keeper of this entire story. You know, and you know what it's like shooting out a sequence and like a big crazy game of blindfolded Jenga or something. But at the end of the day, he understood what he wanted to do, and he understood all of our characters, and he was there for us. And that's even before I talk about him as an artist. And I think we can all say very succinctly and quickly that we understand him to be a great thinker and a sensitive man, which contributes to him being a really great artist and a collaborator with a great team.
Most certainly, and the final product is brilliant. On a final note, Joel, and I asked all of your co-stars this very same question, but what did you learn from this experience of working on the Underground Railroad, both professionally and just in general?
Well, professionally, as somebody who's been a director before and a writer, I love to learn something from each director I will work with. Hopefully, I like to take something from them and put it in my pocket. And from Barry, one of the great things was freedom and expansion. You know, he had a scene or a script and it would look just so, but he would let people spill off the page. he would create moments that didn't exist in the script if he had the space and the time. And he would pay keen attention to what actors were doing in order to move in a direction that he felt was suitable and in keeping with his vision. And I found that a really good lesson. Like, don't just stick to the margins. Like, if you can, spill on out. Like, let the world exist outside the page. And about myself, as an actor, I learned to remind myself that challenges and daunting challenges are worth the risk. They're worth the undertaking. It's been one thing that always draws me to a project. If I've never done something before, if I feel a bit overwhelmed by the prospect of moving into something, it's often a sign that I'm creatively interested and curious about my ability to fill a space or to move into something I've never thought about before. And I was certainly feeling those things before this. And, you know, under Barry's charge, I felt safer, but there was still a fear going into it. And it reminded me to continue to move in directions that feel a little terrifying. And, you know, I had a lot of terror, a lot of disconcerting feelings heading into some of the material. But, you know, that's the job of an actor. You got a day, there's all these people, there's all this money being spent. You got to do it right. You got to do it more than right. Maybe you've got to go home feeling hopefully satisfied, service the story and your part within that story. And feel like you haven't failed. You know, failure is not an option.
Yeah. Well, thank you so very much for shedding light on this character, on this process, and on this show. And thank you so much for joining us today, Joel. To our viewers, make sure to check out The Underground Railroad on Amazon Prime Video if you haven't already, and make sure to click subscribe before you leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you.